It's everywhere. You can't get away from it. All right. Well, great to be with you all again. Do you want me to join audio or
no?
not? Right.
No, you're good.
Later.
Go into presentation mode.
Thank you for that reminder. Okay. Right. Okay. So what I want to do is just let me see if I can do it. Sorry. All right. So as usual, just I so enjoy this time of being with you all because I just love exploring these kinds of issues, right? And appreciated the discussion at the end last week. Ted, thanks so much for bringing up PCUSA and decolonization. I was actually just flipping through that after you mentioned it, and I really want to look into that a little bit more. And for next week, as you see with the agenda, it fits in really well for kind of bringing things together. So just a little bit of reminder, right? What we are trying to do in these 3 sessions is to figure out what is decolonization, what its scope is, and from a Christian viewpoint, right, how to engage it in a productive way, both in terms of its things that are useful and things that might give us a bit of pause. So for this morning, I'm just going to start with a recap from last week. Again, reminding us how people are using the terms colonization, decolonization. Quick reminder, right? It's much more than just a colonizing a particular geographic space. It has to do with knowledge and culture and systems. It has impacts at the individual and societal level. And then what I thought I'd do is go through how decolonization, how colonization and decolonization is being seen and applied in some very concrete areas, right? And I'll cover health, agriculture, education, and finance. I figured I'd do that just to really, hopefully, give us a good sense of what's happening out there, how these things are playing out, and I know we'll see themes, right? Themes that will be useful then, because of course it's being applied in many other areas. So whenever you run across it, hopefully it gives us, or whenever we run across it, gives us a good grounding and background to be able to understand and engage in the discussions there. We'll probably at the end, we'll have a bit of time, but I really, as usual, interrupt me with questions, with comments. At the end, we'll talk a little bit over what I call some musings about, just from a more sociological and theoretical perspective, and leave for next week, kind of bring it together from a Christian perspective. Of course, we'll address some of that this week as well. All right, so that's what we're going to do. So let me start with a quick recap there, right? That, as we said, decolonization is being used all over the place. Some of my favorites, right? The art world, fashion, diet, publishing, the internet, media, right, along with the ones that we talked about.
Can I ask a question?
Absolutely.
Reclaiming to what?
Okay, thank you. So reclaiming would be, so indigenous lands have been seized, right? So reclaiming is meaning taking back ownership of them, right? And so if you're here in the United States, right, there are several tribes, right, that have sought to reclaim land. Many times it's not feasible for them to become the owners of that land, but that leads to reparations. In other countries, very much actually returning lands to the people is very much in play, right? It just depends on it. Thank you for that question.
And the other question is, how far back does it go?
And that's part of, right, part of the politics of it. You're absolutely right, right? I mean, yeah, and Supreme Court, I think it's one of the Supreme Court justices, Kavanaugh, if I remember correctly, is actually very supportive of upholding the original treaties, right? So this is being played out at the highest levels, right, of our society at least. Yeah. How back you go? I think people would say you go back to when things were signed, in a sense, right?
So, but it's really, reclamation is really about ownership, right?
Correct.
Ownership rights?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah, ownership right. You know, who was the original owner? And then of course that gets into what does ownership mean, right? Private title, communal title, and brings up all kinds of land issues as well. So, right, to understand then what decolonization means, as we talked about last week, we need to understand what concepts of colonization and colonialism is. Obviously, as we talked about, the simplest form, the most kind of political form, the form that most people are used to understanding is you by military force or might, right? You go in, you occupy a territory, those people become your subjects in some way, shape or form. Talked about the British Empire last week a bit, but we also pointed out, right, the colonization, even that kind of colonization had mixed motives to it. There was a desire, right, to bring those primitive, quote unquote, people into a civilized fold. And what that meant was that that particular colonial project, that aspect of it, was based on inherent superiority of knowledge, of culture, of systems. So the Western knowledge, culture, and systems were seen as the best. Indigenous knowledge, culture, systems were seen as primitive and not useful. And there was an inherent aspect of race, right? That the whites had it, right? The non-whites did not. And key is, right, as we talked a little bit, or at least alluded to, that really this fundamentally is an exercise of power, right? Whose knowledge, whose control really is the one that can prevail, both from a resource point of view, but also from a knowledge and from a psychological point of view. So the end result, again, as we saw yesterday, is that so the analysis goes is all of these different kinds of systems are set up, right, to benefit the colonial, those who engage in the colonizing, diminishing the others. These systems continue to oppress, leading to marked differences as far as justice and benefits are concerned. Also then that the knowledge that Indigenous people have and people of color have is played down, and we can all benefit from that. This affects all areas of life, and some of the terms that we now have are neocolonialism, colonial logics, even settler imposed systems. Those are ones that you see time and time again. So decolonization, then, to finish up the recap, it's not just about throwing off, right, governments from outside, but also really doing away with that mantle of superiority of knowledge and culture and systems. And really, I don't think I overstated, decolonization really is saying those need to be replaced with these indigenous ones. Some, as we've seen prior, talking about combining them, the best of both, but really right now, I think the vast majority really are positing, right, these indigenous aspects of knowledge as superior to the Western ones. And as a result, the benefit is not just for those who are colonized, whether we talk about still being controlled militarily, but those who have bought into, right, the colonial logics, it's for their benefit as well. So goes the argument, right? Because these kinds of knowledges, these kinds of perspectives actually will help everybody to be better off. And you'll see the word regenerative a lot, right? Regenerative knowledge and practices, and we'll get into that a little bit more. So before we go, any additional thoughts or questions based on that recap before we plunge into the specifics of health and agriculture, education, and finance, and how this is being applied?
David, do you want to replace the word replace with integrate?
No, I actually, there are some that are pushing for integration. I do think the primary push right now is for replacement. I mean, if you look at, I'm not saying that I'm advocating for that. I'm just kind of portraying the arguments that are out there right now. I think it's quite clear that there's an argument that these indigenous approaches are superior to the Western ones. You're starting to get a little bit of kickback now, right? People saying it's gone too far, the pendulum swung too far, but I think by and large, the default, if I can even say assumption, especially among those that are really using this, the default assumption is that the indigenous approaches are superior. So
David, excuse me, one question that's based on facts. Back when Andrew Jackson was president, with a nod to Sandy here, Cherokee Nation won a Supreme Court trial. And Andrew Jackson's response was, well, you can have Justice Marshall and his army come and try to fight me and my army while we send the Cherokee back. We know that was wrong. That was a violation. Now, in this decolonization, how do you and what steps do you actually do to make up for that clearly illegal step by the U.S. government?
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things, and as we'll see, right, I do think that there may be a time and a place for that pendulum to swing to the default that the indigenous approach is superior. And I'll just take that as an example. My understanding, at least from the reading and from the research that I've done, is that I don't know of any tribes in the United States that are actually saying, okay, give us back our land, right? What they're saying, again, this is a very indigenous approach, is what is the best way to move forward that benefits us all, right? That is a very indigenous perspective, is a common good. So looking at, okay, obviously redress the wrongs, but redress them in such a way that doesn't, in a sense, really undermine other people's well-being, right? Other people who own the land. So I may be overstated, but I don't think I am. So the question that you asked really is, at this point, is, I think, the object of much discussion and discernment, both by the tribes themselves, as well as by the legal cases that are being brought, right? So, for example, how far back do you go? What is a legitimate basis? What does it mean today in terms of upholding the treaties that are signed? I was just reading one where I believe one of the tribes had right to representation in Congress, non-voting representation. So that's an issue right now, right? Do you respect what was signed and actually place somebody in Congress, right? And that's a legal debate right now. So I do think that it is very much a process of discernment that is occurring right now. And I just love the way that, at least from what I've been able to see, that the indigenous people are approaching this not in a vindictive fashion, but really in accordance with their own principles, is how do we work on this together now that we are living together in this land? I don't know if that helps or answers your question, but.
No, that does. The Oneida Indian tribe up in upstate New York, which was around Oneida, New York, and that area, was moved by treaty over to the Green Bay area. And there was a lawsuit brought, and I'm trying to look for it right now, and how it was disposed about 30 years ago. If you were buying a property, a home in Oneida and in those areas around Syracuse, the property title would be guaranteed except for the Oneida Indian claim against the land. And I had an old boss that moved back, and we thought that was interesting. He had no title if that action would prevail.
Interesting. Tim, yeah.
Just thinking somewhat in theory, but also in practice, any change involves loss of what we had before we adopt something new. And I can hear some people say, well, you know, anytime a new group comes in or a new way of thinking comes in and advocates change, that's bad because we're losing something. But, you know, when you put things like medicine and, you know, diet and things like that, I'm thinking, well, there can be good, healthy changes. It still means we're losing the old way we used to do things, but that's not necessarily wrong. And so I'm
It's called compromise.
how do we determine what changes are good and maybe it has to be done more in a cooperative way rather than one person or one group saying this is how it's going to be, live with it.
Right.
But, you know, if we just said, well, we're not going to risk losing anything, so we're never going to change or upgrade, we're going back to the dark ages or something.
And as you're saying, compromise would be one word that you could use, right? Discernment together in terms of the common good, right? Based on, again, kind of discussions. It's interesting, is kind of getting away from destructive practices a loss, right? I don't know if a loss versus gain is the right framework, but you're right. I mean, something needs to be discarded, right? And many times it is the mentality. And so, yeah, so I think these conversations, again, are occurring, and they're occurring in every single field. right? I think the danger is, right, do you throw out some of the good, right? In other words, do you lose some of the good that exists, even as we'll see, right, among those who are labeled as colonialists or colonizers? Because it's not, and what I'll come to is, I don't think necessarily the dichotomy of colonizer and colonized is the best, even though it has some good things to it, because it hides too much on both sides, right? The way that power is exercised, even among the colonized, and sometimes in ways that are not helpful, right? Think about gender issues, right? I know I worked among indigenous peoples in Latin America, and the women were trying to overthrow some of the oppressive elements of the indigenous systems there, right? As far as gender. So good, great. And we'll pick up some of these themes. So let's go now into just each one of these. I'm not going to dwell too much on it, but I really wanted to give you a good sense of what's going on in here. And if you notice, I think the patterns you notice is when you're talking about decolonization, health and medicine, agriculture, education, and finance, you're talking, one, how were the structures set up, and structures set up in such a way, right, that really don't benefit, especially the most vulnerable. Number two, right, what is the thinking that accompanied the setting up of these structures that also is not helpful, right? And then three are particular practices, right, that tend to be practices that also are destructive or unhelpful. So you might just keep that in mind as we go through. And this happens both at the individual level and at the global level as well. So health and medicine, right? This is a basic summary of kind of some of the main points, right? That the healthcare systems, both here in the United States and around the world, right, are set up in such a way that you have unequal treatment and therefore unequal health outcomes. And I think we all know, if you look at the health statistics, right, at least the situation, right, you can see significant discrepancies along these lines. Number two, and this is really one that is becoming more and more backed up by quote unquote scientific discoveries, that the internalization of trauma from change and oppression leads to bad health outcomes, right? So you are beginning to get more research into racial trauma, right? And I'm actually going to give an example on the indigenous side about how changes actually led to health outcomes in a very interesting way. I was just at a conference at CCDA, Christian Community Development Association, and people are talking about epigenetics, right? The way that stress actually can change kind of some of your fundamental, I don't know if it's DNA or chromosomes, epigenetics, and you can actually pass that on to your descendants, right? It's extremely interesting. And the other thing is in terms of structure, right? The donors, the Western donors impose a health research agenda. Western donors control, right, access to health education, medical schools and all that, and they also control the publishing opportunities that exist. So these are just some of the ways that the colonial problem in health and medicine is analyzed. Let's go into just real quickly, right? We do see from stats, right, both here and outside of the country, you just look at discrepancies, right, that people of color have poor health statistics, fewer doctors and nurses serving in those areas. Think about COVID, right? I think we all heard, right? Blacks, Latino, right, were struck harder because of kind of many times the jobs that they had, as well as lack of treatment and health benefits and all that. Along with it, and now we go to the more structural aspect, right? That these high income countries, Western countries really would be what they would be called in this analysis. They have the best institutes for training, for education, for research. That's where the top journals are located. Most of the civil society organizations and nonprofit organizations that work, right, to bring health are located in the North, at least those with the most resources. And so in a sense, again goes the analysis, this is resembles, right, the colonial times where the resources and control of those, right, are found in the North. And even the aid agencies that are serving people in the South, right, come from there, and they're the ones who design the projects. So again, this is the way this is being talked about. So almost all the current campaigns in global health start in the North, or led by people in the North. And of course, there are always exceptions to this. Interestingly then, and you can see parallels with medicine and gender, right? The criticism has been because most of the doctors and researchers over time have been male, right? Female diseases and female medical aspects have not been given as much attention. Same result, same argument here. The kinds of diseases that have been focused on are more those that are concerned to the west, to the north, right? And those such as hypertension, diabetes, right, that don't receive as much attention. Those are
Just an observation, is the reason for that because the donors are all really interested in protecting themselves and theirs?
that would be the conclusion, right? Again, you mirror that it always is set up, right, to benefit those who control the resources. As I said, a lot of very not only interesting but I think valuable insights. Here's the example I was talking about. Again, I have references for all this. I'm sorry I didn't put them in, but an example, right, on a particular reservation, Standing Rock Reservation. I forget where that's located, right? Diabetes used to be rare. The river was dammed, right? It was dammed for, I don't know if it was hydroelectric power or for something else, which ended up flooding, right? The ecosystem in which this tribe was living and on which they depended for their food and everything else. And so the tribe lost, right, their cultural connection, their traditional ways, right, for their particular food and medicine. And after the damming of the river, the rate of diabetes skyrocketed. Interestingly enough, right, nations, first tribe nations, other tribes that have maintained their cultural continuity had lower rates of diabetes. Just again, to give an example of how analyses out there that are extremely interesting, I think powerful, show that health is not necessarily just something that comes from an individual action or decision in terms of what you eat or in terms of your life, right? It also has to do with these kind of cultural types of approaches and cultures in a sense being changed and destroyed, right? Yeah,
That's interesting because I think of the way that infectious diseases that Europeans had built up an immunity to, we came here and First Nation people didn't have it. And so I understand that causal effect on health and many deaths, but this is a whole different way.
It's a whole different way. Yeah, the other one you can, the other one you can trace materially, right? The cause and effect. So it's really, it's a germ, they didn't have immunity, boom. Here it really is, the trauma that's internalized, then also both the trauma that's internalized and what they have access to, and all of a sudden, boom, right, you have this. And of course, there are different ways possibly of explaining it, but I mean, the impact seems to be pretty clear. Again, from a knowledge perspective, and we've talked about this a little bit, natural medicine, indigenous medicine is kind of put to the side because of the superiority of the European ones. And remember, this is not just kind of a view of the superiority of European medicine is not just held by Europeans, right? I mean, that becomes then quote unquote internalized by those who are being colonized, right? Because I remember one story, I mean, if you have medicine that can cure certain diseases that hadn't been able to be cured locally, right? Of course, you're going to use it and people are going to be happy about it. And the argument again, bit by bit, is they start seeing everything that comes from the West as superior, right? Because it is so effective in so many different ways. And of course, downplaying then their own resources. And here is where we get to, right? More and more now you're seeing, yes, now let's uphold, let's reclaim, if I can use it in this context, the knowledge, right? That the indigenous knowledge, and integrate that with Western medicine. This is, especially in health, you do see a lot more arguments about integration rather than just superior of one over the other. I think in part because it's so clear that Western medicine is so effective in so many different ways.
But we still have quacks on TV. The one channel on multiple channels is dedicated to it, and it's allowed to persist. And for somebody who worked in Newark, New Jersey, and in North Philadelphia almost my entire life, I never saw us providing any less care for those people there that we cared for than they had out here. In my whole feeling, it was just poverty was the main problem. They just didn't have the money.
Right.
and they didn't have the wherewithal. But the healthcare that they were provided, I don't think was any less. I think it was better than what we saw practice out here in the main line.
I think one of the arguments, that's great. I think one of the arguments would be around preventive care, right? In other words, what like leading up to, so the treatment, I think people would agree, right? That I think access to treatment would also be something that people would say, I'm not so sure that people are able to access, as you're saying, for the poverty issue. And I think it'd also be prevention, both in terms of education and other things along those lines. So good point.
A place where I saw that, or encountered the integration that you're talking about between the two. So my dad was a dentist, and in World War II, he was in the Army of Occupation in Japan. Now, my father was a diehard Western medical school theorist, I guess you could say, and practitioner. But while in Japan, he actually saw a person undergo a gallbladder removal. Well, instead of traditional anesthesia, they used acupuncture and hypnosis.
Wow. Isn't that amazing?
And
Yeah.
he was absolutely convinced at that point that these alternative theories and practices do have merit. Now, he didn't actually learn many of them and participate in them, but he did say they do have merit for those who are involved. So,
A number of countries in Asia, as they emerged from colonial rule, set up medical schools for the training of practitioners in Ayurvedic medicine. And of course, underlying the presence of the Chinese population, you always had a strong presence of Chinese drugstores and Chinese medicine in those communities, let alone acupuncture.
And I think what you brought up, right? How can you distinguish quackery, right, from legitimate? And I think that's just an ongoing question, right? Yeah.
there'll always be snake oil for sale.
For sure. Great examples. Thanks for bringing those up. All right, so let's so then in terms of the actual processes of decolonization, right? These are the ones that tend to come out of the literature, right? Increase the ability of local peoples and local knowledge, right, to have a say. Also, again, based on that, what example, don't just look at how treating the individual is kind of the way to go, right? Because there may be social aspects to this, trauma aspects, right? And we're getting more and more, into trauma-informed care, right? And trauma-informed this and that. So I think we're moving this direction.
Even Western medicine, I think, has a bias because treatment provides profit opportunity. When you remove an underlying cause, you're taking away a business's way to make money.
Right, and that's actually, I'm glad you brought that up. I hadn't put it here, but very much in this decolonization language, people point to the connection between all these things: health, education, agriculture, and the for-profit motive, right? And the way that does tend to skew things. And again, you can see, right, reconnecting to who we were before our respective colonization, right? Creating holistic healthcare. It kind of, again, that's kind of the approach, the perspective that is being promoted in this analysis. All right, let's go to agriculture. Let's go to agriculture. Again, I don't want to dwell too much on it, just give you a little bit of a sample. There's a lot out there as well. You can see the language here, right? Global food system. Again, think about agriculture is built on the colonial model of extraction of natural resources, right? And so when you're going to decolonizing agriculture, really the focus is on sustainable agri-food systems, right? And again, you can see the indigenous knowledge. So you have the structural side of things, you have the knowledge side of things. We'll see some of the culture as well, right? But again, it's important to think about, when you think about agriculture from this perspective, right? The way that global agriculture and the global food system is set up, right, is one that, again, as we talked about, is built on profit, but also was built on extraction. So you immediately go to large scale industrial farming as kind of the bogey person, if I can talk about it that way, right? Again, you can see the language, right? Large scale industrial farming bad. It's based on the domination of humans over the environment, of disconnecting food production from food consumption because it's just large. And of course, then the use of all of these things like pesticides, synthetic fertilizers are harmful to the people on the planet, right? And all of these things, as I say, these are arguments that have been advanced before as well. It's just this time now they carry this label of decolonization, right? It's a different perspective from which to look at it. And so decolonizing agriculture really has to do with going towards an ecologically viable and sustainable food system. And what does some of that look like? Well, again, what people will point to is, hey, the indigenous people have been on this land for thousands of years and they never destroyed it, right? They fed themselves fine. So we really have to look to them for knowledge on how best to do this. And you can see some of the examples there, right? Their farming and grazing practices. And not only do these conserve the soil, they're good for climate change. And this argument I didn't put in there, but it also helps promote community, right? Both with the environment, with creation, as well as with each other. So again, just want to give you a little bit of a sample of what's being said out there.
Just one comment, the Sri Lankan people went through, and I think they took this way too far. Because they went to this type of agricultural model. Their yields dropped so far, the country is now in crisis. It's not food security, it's now food insecurity. They don't have enough to feed their people. They used to be an exporter. They don't even have enough to feed their own people now.
Well, and to your point, when we worked in Honduras, we definitely brought in quote unquote some Western methods, even of soil conservation and planting crops and improved seeds, and their yields went up 2 or 3 times. The Green Revolution, right? So great point, right? That's what I'm saying. Sometimes the pendulum kind of swings a little bit too much. That's not to discount, right, some of the arguments here, but yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. So again, some of the additional suggestions then, you can see the language there. Really, the one that I mostly wanted to point to on this slide, and I'm sorry for so much, I just, again, wanted to give you samples, is that regenerative global food system, right? That word regenerative, right? That continues to be sustained, continues to give life, is very much language that you will see. All right, let's go to decolonizing education. We actually last year covered a little bit of this unknowingly on my part. At that point, I wasn't really focused on the word decolonization, but you'll see many of the some similar themes from critical race theory, intersectionality, and of course, social justice. Out of all the areas, it's interesting, education is the one where the race element comes out the most in terms of how it's being expressed. You'll get, and the other ones, it's more indigenous. In education, it's more focused on especially Blacks and people of color, but primarily African Americans. And it may be right because there has been such a focus on inner city African American school systems versus others, right? So what does decolonizing education means? Again, the analysis is the students of color are at a disadvantage in our educational system. So you need to have this open dialogue of race and racism, how education is structured, right, to not create the needed benefits for people of color. And what that means then is education requires decolonization. This is one way of framing it across teaching, research, institutions, the state, and then reparations. And so an interesting example for looking globally, right, African children are taught the history of the global North, but in the North, we're not taught the history, right, of the global South or of Africa. Just again, you can see an inequity, a difference. And why? Well, I think it makes sense, right? Because most of the power is here in the North. People are taught to speak English because that opens up access to opportunities for business and other things. So you can understand the way the system reproduces itself in terms of the superiority of certain languages and in certain kinds of knowledge as well. And again, right, the emphasis that the knowledge of the North is scientific model, right? It really dominates what people are taught in school, both here and abroad. So what do professors have the task of doing then? I think it's pretty straightforward and you know, even at this point, even without me putting it up there, you could probably imagine it for yourself, where you want to question these established paradigms. You want to make sure that you bring in knowledge that perhaps has been suppressed. You really want to make sure that you take a look at the way that power shapes all kinds of different things. And so some of the concrete solutions in terms of education, right? You revamp the curriculum to make sure that Indigenous voices are included. Do the same thing with your syllabi. Think about classroom dynamics, right? As opposed to just possibly lecturing and communicating knowledge. You have critical thinking, right? You have engagement of student perspectives. Once again, I want to emphasize, this is something that's been talked about for a long time under different labels. It's just that now this is under this decolonization label. And the rest are pretty much along those lines. Yeah.
That last point, bringing all students to mastery. Is that meaning that we should help all students to be high school graduates and able to go to colleges and universities and things? And how does that take into account different academic level, you know, just you know, some students aren't.
Some people aren't students.
College.
So I think it's a little bit of that, but it's more bringing all students to mastery in terms of raising their awareness and consciousness around the issues of power and power dynamics, not necessarily, I mean, yes, mastery of the concrete content, right? Doing everything you can, but even more, it's really more along the lines of teaching them to think critically and to look for different areas of knowledge as opposed to just a dominant one. So it's both mastery of content, but even more in this terms is teaching them to be lifelong learners and lifelong listeners, right? I don't know if that makes sense or not, but that tends to be the argument there.
Well, the two thoughts that come to mind from teaching in Palmer is just that some students still were not, didn't have the writing skills that you normally would expect at that kind of graduate school level. Is that because they've not been taught that or encouraged to learn that, or
Maybe they should have become carpenters and plumbers.
Well, I think the fundamental assumption here goes back to, and actually we were just having this discussion yesterday on Faculty Senate at Eastern, is I think the fundamental assumption in this particular framework is that all students have the capacity, and it really is up to the teachers and the responsibility of the teachers to find pedagogical methods, to find teaching methods that will enable them to do so. I brought up the same exact argument you said. I said, some of these students don't want to be here, and some of the students have more capacity for this kind of thing than others. So what does that mean? So, but I do think, again, that in this particular kind of approach, the argument is going to be, no, everybody has the capacity to do it. It's just that you're not doing a good enough job, right, of teaching them. Which I think on the one hand has merit, because sometimes we may give up on students too quickly. But on the other hand, I do think there are fundamental differences in gifts and skills, right? We're all wired differently and with different predispositions. And that's one of the places I think where, this integration of, okay, well, yeah, it may be that we're overlooking some, but there are also some concrete situations and some concrete things there that are just real. And that's like, that's part of the discussion that's occurring right now.
Or another example that comes to mind is and I'm not sure I'm using the right terminology here, but business and academic English compared to
Conversation.
Ebonics,
right, population English, and just the way that if I was a Black person, raised in Philadelphia, something I might be using language and grammar and things that fits in with my Black culture there, but would not help me if I was looking for a job in corporate America or something like that, and to change that way of speaking, is that another example of decolonization?
Change that way of speaking would be considered a process of colonization, because you would be forcing, the person with their own way of speaking to assimilate into the structure of power. right? But that doesn't take away that, I mean, the issue is very real. I mean, that's a really, and that is an issue that continues to be debated, right? To what extent should you conform, right, to the structure of power in order to have access to opportunities, or should the structures change and accept, right, Black English or another way of expressing as also normal or just a different way? Yeah.
Can I talk street in the boardroom and be effective?
Exactly. Well, not only be effective, can I talk to you in the boardroom and be accepted and embraced, right? In addition to being effective, right? Yeah. Yeah. Good points. Great questions. Great discussion. All right. So this one, I thought this is a little bit more what some people would call kind of radical decolonization, unschooling school, right? So the argument there is that school itself, Western school systems, right, remove children from community life and therefore kind of from cultural transmission, had carried all these problems by segregating by age, right? You didn't have kind of peer-to-peer education, limited play, school. And again, you've had these criticisms by people like Freire and others, right? Enforced competition, prevented collaboration, right? And all of these are typical of a colonial mechanism of divide and rule, right? And so division and ruling tends to be one of the main criticisms of what colonizing did and continues to do. So what is the solution then? Well, the other problem is, and here you'll hear echoes of last year. Remember we talked about the math curriculum and how there were movements away from getting the answers right, right? Well, this is really kind of in a sense where it comes from, because the criticism is by adopting this approach to school, right? You're also enforcing a worldview that there's just one truth, right? And that anything and everything is either right or wrong, right? And of course, the truth becomes associated with the dominant paradigm. I think we all agree that applying this to math was taking a little bit too far.
Yeah.
So, right, but again, you can understand the logic behind it is if you are criticizing, right, the aspect or the way that school itself is structured. And as part of that, you're criticizing a culture that is insisting that everything is either right or wrong. You can see how you start getting to that conclusion there. So what's the solution? Is self-directed education. There's actually an alliance for self-directed education. You can kind of think apparently, and I don't know too much about this, in homeschooling, there's a method called unschooling, where really it's just much more based on the interests and gifts of the children themselves, and you structure things around that.
One of the movements is a pod movement where it's back to neighborhood community schools.
Okay.
Community will hire a local teacher, and it's like the old one schoolroom. Multiple grade levels, all the kids in the neighborhood are together, and it's community education.
But how do you know what's the right one to do? How are you going to scientifically say this is better than that? I mean, in medicine, we have these double-blind placebo-controlled studies.
Right.
And I think we finally come up with the right way to do it.
Right.
I mean, how are you going to, from what we know now, but you have all these different ideas. Who makes that policy? Who sits on that committee
Right.
to make these decisions?
Let me throw that question back to y'all. Who, according to the decolonizing approach, who should be making those decisions?
Parents.
I disagree. I think there's, you can't say I went to Google, I know the answer.
Right.
And I just wonder, are we big enough? And, what is the policy behind any and all of this? And I think it has to come from some degree of rational thought. I mean, if I took 100 programs like Frank just talked about, I took another 100 programs there and look at them and see what happens 10 years from now, maybe we would have the answer. But do we do that? Maybe we have to.
Yeah.
Back to
Well,
beginning.
education, there is a lot of research around, and there's constantly research around what are the best methods, right? Both of teaching and what are the other factors, class size and things like that come into play. So my sense is that this is part of a lot of that continuing swirl. And I do think people will start researching if this grows big enough, right? Is this something that actually has some merit to it or not? Or are there aspects of this that we can integrate into what we're doing in the classroom? And we've already seen, remember the whole language approach that got away from
My daughter's a victim of that. She cannot write a paragraph. She has no idea the parts of speech. and she speaks nothing in the passive tone. And she was a whole language person from Conestoga, Trinidad from Easttown School District. I think she was at a disadvantage.
And as a result of that, right, there's been a lot of criticism, then people have started to go to a balanced approach where they integrated more phonics and things like that, right? Unfortunately, as you point out, some people suffer along the way, right?
Yeah.
Because it's kind of experimental. I think was there a question in the chat there?
It was Ted. Steve saying he had to drop off.
Oh, okay. All right, good. So we're almost, oh, I'm sorry. I didn't realize I was having so much fun. Decolonizing finance, you can see more of the same thing, right? Ethical banks, banks that focus in on their community, regenerative bankers, right? Decolonize finance in terms of that. Circles profits back into the community. Again, things that we've heard about before. Community banking is not new, but it's under the label now of decolonization. And a book that I just thought I'd flash to you all that I signed, it's called Decolonizing Wealth. Decolonizing Wealth by Villanueva. He talks about, again, along the arguments that you can think about, that wealth has been used to do some bad things. How do we heal from it? You can see those characteristics there. So I apologize, I completely lost track of time because I was so excited about the conversation. All right, so just some quick musings. Why do I think decolonization is so powerful as label? I think it's particularly powerful because if you try to go against it, you automatically put yourself in the mold of a colonizer, right? It inherently sets up you're either a colonizer or you're not, right? So if you start making arguments against decolonization, you automatically, right, fall into that other camp. I think it's incredibly useful, not incredibly, but very useful because it does get right at how power is exercised in ways that you might not immediately think or so, right? I think one of the questions that comes up is that dichotomy of colonizing, decolonizing useful? I think it has some dangers, right? Because you only see it in an either or mindset, and also it's inherently judgmental, right? And as I said before, it doesn't really point to some of the complexities for how power is used among those who are colonized. And I also think more and more, it is a label that's being applied to anything and everything, which means that I think it starts to use its usefulness. I was just, again, at CCA, there are a couple things, and I'll bring the specific quotes in next week, but where I just started thinking, that's not the most productive lens through which to look at it, decolonizer or colonizing. There's some other things that are going on. So, and finally, what would a Christian approach, and this is all things that we're going to dig into next week. I think as we're approaching this, first of all, right, we need to look at our own history, missions, and what our denominations are doing. And Ted, again, thank you for that. I'm really going to look into more on that. But I really think we need to recognize from a Christian perspective, first of all, that sin permeates everything, but also that God is working in all, right? And foundationally, as we're both aware of the sin nature that we all are a part of, and that God does work through everybody and everybody to help us to see certain things that we need to default, right, to seeing how we can learn and support those who are oppressed. So that's as far as I've gotten right now in terms of those musings. And next week we'll dig into this a lot more. So other thoughts, questions, comments?
Yeah, there's a book written by Heather McGee called The Sum of Us. And the principle of the book is that teaching against zero-sum approaches.
Yeah.
And I was thinking that in what professors need to teach and solutions and so forth, and avoiding the binary approach of colonizer or decolonizer is sort of by the whole Sum of Us approach to incorporating aspects into society of different cultures, because we're all living in proximity to each other, that ultimately is a way of slowly decolonizing without upending the old order and causing consternation and rejection in that regard.
Thanks for that, Scott. Yeah.
Well, I come from the Micah 6:8 school as a foundation for approaching the entire subject, being merciful, loving justice, and being humble about it. So that will be my approach.
Yeah, and I think part of being humble, more and more kind of the label of listening is coming in, which I think really has a lot of power to that. Actually, just with another person was doing a little bit of writing on this, and that listening paradigm, right, really has a lot to say for it, especially from a biblical perspective in many ways.
Yeah.
And I do think it's important to note that I do think that all of this right now, we're really very much in an experimental phase. And, you know, we're talking about kind of perhaps a gradual or incremental approach to thing. I think these are things and even ideas that people are experimenting with that hold a significant amount of power. But as we were talking about before, right, as you do experiment with new methods, if all of a sudden they're implemented without kind of thinking about or even researching what the consequences might be, you can also, things can go a little bit haywire, right? You just never know.
When my daughter was in the Templeton School at Eastern, she brought home a book that they had used in one of their courses and said, Dad, I think you ought to read this. I think you'd enjoy it. And I see lots of applications of the information in that book to what you're talking about here. It's an older book at this point, Guns, Germs, and Steel.
Oh, yeah, yep.
And I would explain it as an explanation of the expansion of populations. And I think a lot of this dealing with colonialization comes from the need for cultures and populations to find solutions to their problem of expanding numbers.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of that comes back to the fact that we have ever-growing populations, and that a lot of that has to do with, for a period of time, you wanted to have large families because many of your family did not live. And we've overcome much of that need to have procreation, to expand our population. Now we have the problem of how do you limit that expansion of population, so you get into procreation rights and all that other business. A lot of this comes back, I think, to originating from those sorts of problems.
I would say along with that would be analysis as far as expansion is also about the level of living and the comforts that you want to assure your own population.
That we've grown to.
That you've grown to, or that you continue, right? So iPhones and all that, right, require certain kinds of raw materials. And so, you know, that aspect of power and control over resources, and therefore control over the way people perceive and think about things, continues to be with us. But yeah, that book is, I think, a particularly good one that explains some of that drive.
Well, and how do we practice the call for missions and evangelism in a way that doesn't colonize? Yeah, we're the tension between from what we're hearing from our faith and teaching is Jesus is the only way, and wanting to share that message, which seems to say your belief system is wrong, flawed. So
yeah, I don't think, at least from my experience, I'd be interested in hearing your all's experience that, I mean, with the exception perhaps of hierarchies, that people don't mind you sharing what you believe is true, right? It's when that sharing becomes possibly coercive or attached to resources where the problem starts, right? And so going in and saying, I believe Jesus is the only way, so as I believe, you know, Muhammad, and that is the only way, you know, you can have, but once you say, you know, I believe Jesus is the only way, and if you don't agree with me, you're not getting this aid. Or if you don't agree with me, then we're not including you in this. Or, you know, that's, I think, where it happens. And one of the problems, right, with missions, and we'll look at this next week, is people didn't, you know, many missionaries didn't allow the local population to read the Bible and come to their own conclusions, right? Which was a problem because missionaries were reading the Bible through their own cultural lens. And as much as they had great insights, there were insights that were just completely flawed, right?
And part of why local languages were also suppressed, because it's not just, this is how you think, this is how you talk.
Yeah.
Taking,
Go ahead.
taking a cue from Scott, he raised the 800-pound elephant in the room, and that is world population, because the 20 largest countries in Africa have an average of 5 children per family right now. So that the specter of that impact of that on agriculture, on education, on health, every aspect of their society, there's going to be, it's a world problem we've got to face.
The interesting thing along those lines, it's been shown time and time again that as people's level of living increases, the number of children they have goes down. And so again, that brings back the question, to what extent, if in fact, right, things can be set up so that the poor are given opportunities to access to resources, in Africa, access to land, right? And quote unquote, the nation can create better infrastructure in such a way that all people benefit. At least past experience has shown that that population problem will take care of itself. And as a matter of fact, right, the quote unquote more developed countries now are facing the opposite problem. They don't have enough people, right, for work, to work, to carry things out. And that's where immigrants become so important.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, that's a very good problem. I do hesitate a little bit to point to population growth as a problem, just because that argument has been used so many times to say, you know, that people just shouldn't have as many children. And there's a lot of things that go into the joy, right, of children and big families. It almost seems, again, that the way that as things evolve, that problem takes care of itself. But that's another discussion. Yeah.
The population in Nigeria going to double from 219 million to over 500 million by 2050 in a country the size of Oklahoma and Texas together. And that is a problem.
That is a problem. I would agree. Yeah, I do think, and I'm sorry, I didn't mean to say that it's not that it's not a problem anywhere. There are certain places where it is definitely a problem. Sometimes what's happened is, right, people say population growth is a problem, but then you look at the tenure of land holdings and you can see the land is so concentrated, right, that it really wouldn't be a problem if there was a more equal or more just distribution of land. But you're absolutely right. There are places where it is a significant problem.
Well, and the wealth imbalance in the world is a factor. Those underdeveloped countries seeking resources, but the people that hold the resources have many more resources, but they're trying to hold on to it and just dole it out in small amounts, but not give up their wealth control. And the big argument, of course, is redistributing wealth, taking it away from those who have it and giving it to those who don't, is a challenge.
Yeah, that's a challenge. And especially, I know I'm more familiar with Latin America. If the laws, especially the taxation laws, were actually applied, there'd be plenty money for the countries to have to invest in their own. Let me close this with prayer. I was just asked to, and then we can continue our discussion either afterwards or next week. Lord, we give you thanks for the way that we can come around this table and put it on this table, difficult issues, different points of view. I thank you for the way that in this day and age, it is quite easy to find out what people are thinking, what people are doing. And I thank you for the way that many thoughtful people, many committed people have embraced this framework of decolonization. Lord, you know some of which gives us pause that we've talked about now. Help us to continue to deepen both our understanding and our insight into kind of the benefits of this approach and applying this perspective, and things that we might want to be wary of. You know that our deep desires to be your faithful disciples in all that we do and all that we say. Lord, please help us to be aware of how things or what things we say, how they might be perceived, even if we don't intend them to be that way. And help us as we continue to engage in this conversation to hold fast to what you want us to hold fast to, but to do so in ways they're humble, and Lord, in ways that we can continue to learn from each other. In Jesus' name I pray, amen.
David,